Dorico 4.3 is out. So this is a free upgrade for anybody who's already got Dorico 4, who's upgraded at any point during that cycle. And it's got a couple of new features, which are sort of headline ones, and then plenty of smaller changes. The question is, has it finally made Dorico reach its potential as the score editor that you want to use all the time? Let's take a look. So let's take a look at generate notes from chord symbols. So this is a new feature of Dorico 4.3, and Dorico's documentation bills it as a powerful and sophisticated way to generate music for one or more instruments based on chord symbols. So this promises to take away a fair amount of the very first stages of dividing up the harmony that you have between the instruments that you have. So it's not a complete auto arrangement tool, but it's something that will take away the kind of potentially tedious grind. So let's just take a quick look at it. So the only prerequisite is that you need to have your instruments. And as you can see here, I've just picked the pit band preset actually. So we've got a wide range of instruments there. And you need to have some chord symbols in. So I've put in some chord symbols there. You'll probably recognize them. And in its most basic form, you just select the bars of music that you want this function to work over on the instruments. So I'm going to pick from the piccolo, first bar, and then I'm going to shift and click on the last bar in the bass. So you can see that all of those have been selected. And then once we get there, we just go to Edit, Notations, Chord Symbols and Diagrams, and Generate Notes from Chord Symbols in Selection. And then you get a new dialog box come up. So there's quite a few options in here, and we're definitely not going to be exploring all of them. But the most basic ones are to do with rhythms. So for instance, you can decide that you're going to override the rhythm for fretted instruments, which we're going to do in this case, because that will mean the guitar will be, in this case, every beat. In terms of fretted instruments, this is quite useful, and as we'll see, it generates sensible chord options when using the defaults. We can do some work for pitch percussion, which we're not going to look at. And also you can pick which instruments would have bass notes in them, etc. So for instance, let's make the glockenspiel play bass notes. So you take it from this list and you click this. This is slightly unintuitive, but this is effectively moving them from this list to this one. So you can move it back that way. And then we've got options in terms of anticipation, etc. And when chord changes don't coincide with notes, you've got options to choose there, which are all pretty sensible. But just with the defaults there, other than the changes we've made, you can click OK. It does some work, voices all the chords for you, and you can see that's all been laid out. So they've all been distributed reasonably sensibly. We'll take a look at the guitar part in a second, but all reasonably sane. And if we play that from the beginning, we've got my first term at music college version of rhythm changes. Obviously at totally the wrong tempo because it's not incredibly fast and making me wish I'd never picked up the guitar. Talking of guitar, let's look at the guitar part. So we can see these parts here. If we look at the guitar itself, let's just change that over so we can see the chord symbols. Or rather chord diagrams, forgive me. And you can see it's generated, if you're a guitarist, those are totally sane inversions of all of those chords. So because it's picked from the library, it's made a reasonable job of it. It's obviously not, super jazz, wonderful voice leading versions, and you would improve on them as a player. But if you just needed to create a lead sheet quickly to hand out, job done as far as I'm concerned. There's obviously more to it than this and many options that you will want to go through yourself, but let's take a look at it when it interprets the rhythm. So here we've got exactly the same chords, but in the piccolo part, we've got something notating the rhythm that we want the chords to follow. So in this case, it's just with eighth note pushes across beat 3. It's nothing, again, particularly innovative or anything like that, but we can do exactly the same process as we saw before. And this time, going to use existing rhythm where possible, and it gives us a list of instruments where a suitable rhythm is present. In this case, it's only the piccolo. We're going to overwrite it for fretted instruments and also for bass instruments. But in this case, we'll make sure they're both on the beat, and then we should get some sense out of those. And let's see what it makes of that. And as you can see, and you'll be able to hear in the background, it's done exactly what we expected, with those chords being pushed across the beat. Now, clearly there's much more to it than this, but there are loads of options that you can follow, and effectively they will depend on the music you put in as well. So there are not infinite options, but there's a great deal of options. But certainly this is the kind of thing I think computers should be doing. They shouldn't write everything for you, but by doing the, let's say, donkey work of just the first sketches of your arrangement, then this can be much more easily done and will mean that you can spend time being creative rather than just grinding out, dividing up notes between different instruments. If we listen to just the piano on its own, again, this is going to be dead easy for somebody to play. You can see there's nice movement in there. It's not jumping around all over the place. And that is true to a lesser degree on the guitar, but then it's been written with the chord symbols and diagrams, etc., which are present. And if we just listen to the glockenspiel part as well. So obviously with all of these things, there'll be a bit of work needed here and there, but this is just a starting point, and it's doing, as I say, a lot of the donkey work for you, which is pretty nice. So the key editor has seen significant revamps over the course of the different versions of Dorico 4, and in 4.3, I think it's now getting to the point where it's much more usable than it was, for a couple of small reasons for me, but they're the kind of things where when they get in your way, they really get in your way. So the main thing that's changed that's made life easier for me is that it now doesn't try to be like an iPad. So we have on-screen zoom, which is nice, rather than the slightly bizarre system from before. And also there's a scroll bar, so you can just move up and down. It's not doing the bizarre thing which was before, which was clearly trying to be like a touch system. I don't think the two systems correlate at all well. There was a trend with user interfaces in operating systems when the iPad came out and Windows tried to be like a touch thing. If you're using touch, it makes sense. If you're using a mouse, it makes zero sense. I never use touch because I don't want peanut butter all over my screen apart from anything else. So just this is so much better. So although that might seem like a minor change for me, this is the difference between being able to use it and not use it. To go along with that, there are some keyboard shortcuts, although they're slightly weird because G zooms in and H zooms out, which is the opposite of Cubase. So they're the same keys, but the other way round. That is quite strange as far as I'm concerned. I'm not sure what the reason for that is. I'm sure I'll be corrected by somebody at some point and they'll say, well, that's because this is the way we do it or whatever. But yeah, it doesn't make sense to me when it's Steinberg that it does a similar thing but opposite. But there we go. You've got Control Shift or Command Shift G and H to zoom in and out vertically, which at least is, again, another nice touch to be able to do that without the mouse. You can access your tools. Again, it's slightly convoluted because a lot of the shortcuts were already taken up with something else. So it's Shift and Option or Shift Out 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 to pick those tools, which is pretty nice. A lot of the rest of it is very similar to what was seen before, but you can edit without having to click in the editor, so you can just get on with your editing. You don't need to select it first, which again, I think is probably because it's no longer doing the touch thing anymore. So just like in Cubase, you can add a controller lane. So here we can add an editor and we can add in pitch bend as well. So we can have pitch bend and velocity both at the same time. If we had a bigger screen, or rather a bigger screen capture area for reasons, you could make that bigger, but it scales kind of nicely between the two anyway, and then you can pick what you want. The transform and histogram tools are now available for CC data, which is pretty useful. In case you haven't seen the 4.1 review, so the histogram tool I think is really great, etc. So you can highlight this. The transform tools here are just really useful. And this histogram tool really should be in Cubase because it's just fantastic. But that can also work on CC data, which is useful as well. There's also new commands available to allow you to switch to all this stuff and control it via keyboard shortcuts or the jump bar, which will make life much easier. So we can see all of those are now available as commands. Most of them have got keyboard shortcuts assigned to them, but there are a couple which don't do, and you can add to them and get to them quickly. You can also select multiple instruments. So as you can see here, I've got the trumpet in B flat selected already. And then we can click view multiple instruments, and then let's add in the second trumpet. And you can see that there, and the third trumpet. So there they are all present. And you can switch them to edit them. So this is something which is useful in terms of viewing musical context and seeing whether each instrument is playing something which makes sense in the context of the group or section that it's in. But aside from all that, as I've already said, there's been lots of little changes which just add up to make it more usable. I'll be honest, I've not been spending an enormous amount of time in Dorico over the last couple of months, but now coming back to it and using it, it just seems much more like a usable editor, particularly in this area, and possibly just because of the navigation, but the other changes that have been made have also made it much nicer to use. There's been a few changes to chord diagrams, so we're going to take a look at some of the options that I think are important. So firstly, it's possible to suppress fingering. Now, this is something that I wouldn't have thought was necessary until I started teaching guitar, and particularly teaching guitar to people who'd been learning elsewhere or just picked it up on their own. And this sprang to mind, actually. So you can suppress the fingering. So this is a pretty standard fingering for a bar chord, but I've actually seen people play with their fourth and third fingers the other way around, and it might be nice to give them the option to do that. So you can actually suppress the fingering. If you type 0 for a particular note, so there and there, then we no longer get fingering in there. So that's pretty nice. Another thing is you can automatically put the thumb in. So we can get Dorico to put thumbs in. So it's more of a, I tend to think of it as more kind of a folk thing, but it's actually, it's sometimes useful to have your thumb playing something because it can give you other options. And sometimes people just play like that. So typically this would be the thumb, which you can do manually. So you could just edit this and then you could type T, and then you can see it changes that bar. So it shows you what's going on with that. So that would be what you would typically do. Or you can get Dorico to do it for you. So under chord diagrams in note input options, we've got these two things here. So we can allow the thumb as the bottom thing, and it can either be for new symbols that you put in, or you can update existing chord diagrams. Sorry, I keep saying symbols, it's diagrams. And if we apply that, you'll see that one will have changed the thumb, and any other ones which would be suitable to do so. And it's generally, from what I've seen, pretty intelligent at doing this, so it can pick those out pretty well. So your bar can either be filled dots or a single line now. So you can see there we've got that single line, and if we change this, you can see we end up with this big chunky one going all the way across there, which can make sense in some context, and certainly does represent what your finger's actually doing. There's been a few detailed changes made to lyrics, but one of the important ones, I think, is you can now export lyrics directly. So you just go to File, Export, and Lyrics. And there you go. You just get a plain text file which has got all of the lyrics in. There's been a number of changes in note inputs. One of them is splitting notes, which is actually quite handy because often I find I've made a mistake and I put the wrong note in. But for instance, here we can move our note input correct to the right place, and then you just do Alt or Option U, and then it splits it at that point, and we could do that again there, etc. So actually, I think this for me will be really, really useful because often I've made a mistake, and it'd be quicker to go back and split that note. And if you're creating things such as dotted rhythms, I'll probably find myself using that quite a bit. So if you select a note, you can go to Write, then Edit Duration, and Split by Note Duration, which is unfortunately off screen, but if we split that into 16ths, there we go. So that will make entering quite a lot of things a fair bit easier, actually. But maybe it's just me that would need to do that kind of thing. But hopefully someone else will find it useful. They've obviously implemented it for a good reason. Play mode's seen a few changes, which again probably pleases me more than most because I come from a sequencing background. So the left zone here has been made a little bigger, and also there's differentiation between this mode and this mode visually, which makes it a little easier because it was sometimes you were like confused as which one you were actually in. We've got a hierarchical menu now, so you can see this. It's not quite as easy to navigate as maybe it might be because you have to click to go to each category, and sometimes you've got, in this case, a meaningless category because Cherry Audio have synth, and then there's only one synth in there. So that's an improvement on how it was, but possibly could do with a little more work at this point. Another welcome return in play mode is the ability to drag and drop MIDI. Now, this is whether or not it's from a MIDI file or it's from a MIDI region, I think they quote it as in the documentation, from Cubase. So here we've got Cubase open, and if I let's drag this nylon guitar part onto here. You can see you can pick nice and clearly where you want to drop it in. So let's drop that in at bar 8. And there you go. Your MIDI is in. It doesn't fit with this song, but it's in there. So that's really useful if you're going between Dorico and Cubase, which certainly I spend a fair bit of my time doing. There's now the option to cycle through the lower zone size. So I've got this set up just on the jump bar because there isn't a default keyboard shortcut, but you can see cycle lower zone size. This works in all the modes, and it's pretty handy actually because if you're in this one and you want to go between that and that quickly, you can do that. Obviously, there are other options such as Command 0, which hides everything, and we'll bring it back. So we can go maximum change really quickly. But again, it's good to have those options and have them as keyboard shortcuts because this is certainly something which in some applications, not everything that was graphically available was linked to any kind of keyboard shortcut. And it means you can't speed your workflow or create useful keyboard shortcuts for you, which means you can work nice and quickly in the way that you want to work. Another nice change is if you go between using single and multiple displays, so if you're on a laptop and sometimes you plug it into an external display, when you go back to single display, the windows which you had on the multiple displays will come back to that single display and not be white, empty, blank windows, etc., that kind of thing. So again, small but useful changes. And there's some more jump bar commands which have been added. So some of them are from existing commands and some of them are from new things which have been introduced as well. So it's good to see the options to be able to control all that kind of thing really quickly, because the jump bar is something I've said before I wish Cubase had for some features, and there's a few other bits and pieces which could do with being stolen from Dorico. Now, what I've not covered here is there are a myriad of small changes which would probably end up being a 2-hour video and take me at least a week to create with examples. There's loads of changes to do with every aspect of notation. So there's literally 40 pages of changes and new features, etc. Some of them are small, some of them, none of them are things that you're necessarily going to write home about, but they're all things where it shows that Dorico is progressing and improving. A lot of them are things I will never ever use because I don't make Gregorian nose flute music. In the same way, there's lots of people who create, music for string quartets who are never going to need the guitar tablature features, which I'm interested in as a sometime guitarist. It's just good to know that it's becoming a more well-rounded package and has improved. There's a few things that are still missing. For instance, I really wish that in play mode or in the mixer, more to the point, that you could add more effects. But then I'm coming from a music technology sequencing kind of production background. So I'm probably more interested in that than most people, because you may well not want to be doing that kind of thing. So the mixer is certainly better than it was back in the day in Dorico 1, but I still think there's some extra capacity for improvements here, which would be nice. I also think maybe there's some streamlining of features. So, for instance, it's really, I find, not having a right click or 2-finger tap menu here to add a player. I know it's only going down here, but I'm so used to adding tracks in that way in the program I use the most, which is Cubase, that not having the option here seems a bit strange, particularly because it isn't doing anything else. So there's quite a few places where I know it's my muscle memory from using Cubase, but I think it makes sense for a particular software house's products to be consistent across the board, particularly where it doesn't compromise what's already there. So there's quite a few things where I almost wish it had like a Cubase mode. Talking of which, I would greatly appreciate it if somebody could explain to me why zoom in is H in Cubase and it's G in Dorico and vice versa. Because that actually had me thinking I was going crazy the first time I did it. And then I thought, oh, well, maybe years ago I changed it in Cubase to the wrong way around. But no, the default is zoom out is G in Cubase and it's zoom in Dorico. And that just doesn't make sense to me. But there we go. So that's my review of Dorico 4.3. Now, normally a 0.1 increment wouldn't warrant a complete review. But in this case, I feel it was important because Dorico seems to have come to a point where it's actually realizing the potential, which I saw many years ago on a wet night at the release in London. I remember buying it on the train on the way home, actually. And up until Dorico 3, personally, I was a little disappointed. Not because it was necessarily lacking features in terms of normal notation, but because tab wasn't in there, guitar notation wasn't in there. And that's my strong suit, as it were. I'm a guitarist and I'm a production and recording person. So clearly that's the lens through which I view everything. I now feel it's got to a point where it's a pleasant, usable tool. When the key editor was introduced originally, the touch navigation was horrible as far as I was concerned. It was really annoying to me because it had all this potential and yet it was spiky and annoying and it just bothered you every time you tried to use it, or I tried to use it, because it was trying to be the same thing as it would be on an iPad. That's not something that's ever worked for me. And I'm really pleased that now you just have standard navigation in there, then you can do it with a mouse, and it just seems to work so much better. Is it perfect? No, not necessarily. Obviously, from a production standpoint, I would rather have more flexibility in the mixer, being able to add different effects channels, etc. But maybe that's not its role. Maybe I'm looking at it the wrong way. There's a few little pieces here and there which are just slightly, maybe a bit janky looking, or things such as the keyboard shortcut being the wrong way around just seems to be strange to me, that it's zoom in and zoom out have been transposed. And it's those little things which annoy you. But overall, I have to say now, Dorico's a pleasure for me to go and use. It hasn't always been the case. So it was a frustrating thing through 1 and 2 because it didn't have what I wanted in there. 3 definitely improved it. But now, because play mode and the key editor in particular have seen so many little improvements, that's a really great thing. One of the things I really like about it is the fact that it's so flexible. It's clear from, if you read the blog from before it was released, that it was going to try to do everything, and I really think it's really trying to do that. So a lot of the features which have been added, you're never going to use unless you write every kind of music and every kind of notation. You're not going to use them, but that's okay with the notation program, because there's loads of features which I'm interested in using to do with guitar notation, etc., which somebody who makes just string quartets is never going to touch. And in the same way, I'm not going to use the things that they do, or the people who make Gregorian nose flute or whatever. That it doesn't matter that they're not in there. What matters is that the features that are in there that you use work well. And for me, that's the case. One of the examples in point is I have an Ibanez RG9. So it's this thing here. I bought it cheap on Gumtree many years ago. I've never really explored it fully, and I know it has immense potential, and one day I'll be able to sit down and do so. And one of the tools that I'll use to do it is Dorico, because you can create a 9-string guitar tuning, and then you can take music you already know and transpose it down an octave, and it will remap it onto the fretboard for you. That, to me, is a fantastic tool. And if Dorico wasn't so flexible, if they just said, well, you can only have a 6 or a 7-string guitar, who has a 9-string guitar, then that would be a problem. But you can create pretty much anything sane, other than like a 42-string bass or whatever. But you can do so much with this program now that I really think it's come to the point where it is worth using, if that's the kind of thing you want to do. But if you don't do notation, obviously it's not going to be the program for you. As I say, it's definitely not perfect, and I think there's some things to come. But as I understand it, 4.3 will be the end of the 4 cycle, although it may not be. I don't know any more in terms of the future, whether or not Dorico 5 is going to have some amazing new features, etc. I know no more than you do. But what I do know is now it's a tool, as I say, which I'm happy to go to and use whenever I need to produce a score. And for me, that's a good recommendation. As ever, I hope you found this video useful. And if you have, please like, subscribe. This week, tell me who your favorite cartoon character was in the comments. And I'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.